is the oldest Jewish human rights organization in the world, operating since 1843 and in Canada since 1875. These events are part of a series being done in conjunction with our League for Human Rights, and is comprised of over 35 committed liaisons to the diverse multicultural communities, the collective minorities that are the new majority and reflective of the new face of Canada. This advisory council, now in its 20th year, brings together community liaisons under the umbrella of B'nai Brith in an unbreakable friendship, as friends are the family that we choose for ourselves. For the last 11 years, I have also been co-chair with the head of intelligence and organized crime of the York Regional Police Chiefs Community Advisory Council, ISCAC. This integrated strategic community advisory council deals with organized crime, terrorism, guns and gangs, drugs, vice, hate crimes, and human trafficking. Some of our impressive past guests that have given us updates and insight into issues that impact our lives and include Jason Kenney, Diane Francis, CIBC World President CEO Victor Dodig, Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Federal Conservative Party, York Regional Police Chief Jim McSween, Toronto Police Chief Myron Demkew, Ontario Provincial Police Commissioner Tom Carrique, Minister Stephen Lecce, Minister of Education, our former Ontario Premier Ernie Eves, Ontario Solicitor General Michael Kerzner, retired Senator Jerry Grafstein, the Consul General of Israel, Edith Shamir, Melissa Landsman, Phyllis Heideman, current president of the Marshall Living, and Majid El Shafi, who is currently working in Israel on Dying to Live, a documentary on October 7th. Our format this evening will be a 30-minute fireside chat with Warren Kinsella and Richard Heideman that will be hosted by Rich Robertson, Director of Research and Advocacy for B'nai Brith Canada, followed by a 25-minute Q&A opportunity with our Zoom guests. All guests will be muted tonight, so once we begin, you must send your questions in through the chat feature, and Rich Robertson will ask your questions of our guests. Everyone, you will now consider yourself being on mute. So let me take a quick moment and do an introduction of our very special guest this evening. Warren Kinsella is the president of the Daisy Consulting Group. Previously, he was a partner in McMillan Binch in his public policy group, and has also worked as a consultant, journalist, and political chief of staff. From 1990 to 93, Warren held the position of special assistant to the Right Honorable Jean Chrétien, leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. In addition, 1993 to 96, Warren served as chief of staff in a number of federal ministries. In 2003, 7, and 11, he was chairman of the War Room in the successful Ontario Liberal Party election campaigns federally. He managed the Liberal Party of Canada's war rooms in 1993 and 2000. Most recently, he helped oversee the 2018 winning campaign for Toronto Mayor John Tory. 2020, he worked in several states on the victorious Biden-Harris campaign. Warren is an award-winning author and journalist, and is a former member of the executive of the Ontario Bar Association. Today, he is Canada's leading pro-Israel journalist with the National Post and leads a war room cleansing anti-Israel and anti-Semitic propaganda. The war room is called Facts Matter. Richard Heideman is a graduate of law from the National Law Center at George University in Washington, D.C., and the American University and Policy Institute at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is licensed to practice law across the USA, admitted before the U.S. Courts of Appeal, Federal and D.C. Circuits, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and U.S. Court of International Trade, U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and the Supreme Court of the United States. His firm handles complex and challenging international matters like terrorism, civil, corporate, and criminal defense litigation cases. They are the lead counsel representing American victims of terrorism in claims against Libya, Syria, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as organizations and financial institutions that support terrorism. They have won judgment of over $2 billion against Iran, and over $4 billion against Syria, against the Syrian Arab Republic. Richard is the author of The Hague Odyssey, Israel's Struggle for Security on the Front Lines of Terrorism, and Her Battle for Justice. Richard Heideman is a former two-term president of B'nai Brith International, former president of the American Zionist Movement, and chair of the Israel Forever Foundation. He served as chair of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Lawyers Committee and chair of the Institute for Law and Policy at the Hebrew University Faculty of Law. Richard is one half of a powerful American family married to Phyllis Greenberg Heideman, a presidential appointee to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, former president of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and currently the president of the March of the Living International. Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud and fortunate to have this evening as our guests, Richard Heideman and Warren Kinsella. And now I'm going to turn it over to our host, Rich Robertson, to carry on for the rest of this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. And on behalf of B'nai Brith and all those in attendance tonight, Warren and Richard, I just want to thank you for gracing us with your presence. I look forward to an informative and enlightful discussion. Gentlemen, I understand that you may have prepared some opening remarks for us to help us center our discussion. So if either one of you wants to go first and posit your thoughts, and then we can just pick up the discussion from there. Maybe Warren, if you want to get us started.
Well, I haven't prepared any remarks.
Okay.
One thing I would note out is we're meeting on a night when there's no other news taking place. It's a very boring news evening, but Richard and I will do our very best. What I've been at work at, I've been writing about neo-Nazism and white supremacy and anti-Semitism for more than 30 years. For newspapers, I've written several books about the subject. And what I can say is, this terrible stuff that the Jewish community experiences and is targeted by, it never fully goes away. There's no region of this country that is immune to it. But I've never seen it as bad as it is now. I've never dreamt in my worst nightmare that we'd actually have in a single week in this country 2 schools in 2 different provinces for children, little kids as young as the age of 4, shot up because they teach Jews. I never thought I'd see in my lifetime an imam standing up in Montreal in front of 20,000 people calling upon God to kill the Jews. I never thought I'd see the attacks on businesses and individuals and synagogues and Jewish community centers and over and over. And throughout that, we have seen, I believe at all levels in this country, total inaction and total ineffectiveness by our elected representatives who have an abundance of laws to deal with this problem and deal with it effectively. But they have not shown leadership, and they have not shown the moral courage that's required to deal with what is a terrible and growing problem. So I'm hopeful tonight that in our discussion, we will come up with some solutions about how to deal with this problem, because it needs to be dealt with.
Thank you very much for that, Warren. Richard, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I do, and it's consistent with what Warren has already said. The silence from presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and ambassadors regarding the hostages taken illegally, inappropriately, wrongly, heinously by Hamas on October 7th has been and continues to be increasingly deafening with each passing day. Other democracies, including the United States, Canada, France, or the United Kingdom, have never and would never tolerate the murder, maiming, beheading, burning, and raping of their citizens by any designated foreign terror organization. The UN and its world courts must be held accountable for singling out Israel for multiple decades and playing into the biased hands of the very countries, such as the Islamic Republic of Iran, the worst sponsor of terror in the world, who barely months ago, and the world already has forgotten, that Iran barely months ago launched hundreds of rockets and drones directed to attack the sovereign state of Israel, and is using its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, to mercilessly attack Israel while continuing to promote and illegally practice economic, academic, and multi-pronged diplomatic boycotts of Israel. The global community must wake up, and it is our responsibility, all of us here, to see to it that the message goes out to the global community to stop demonizing Israel and her leaders, and to support the strongest democracy in the Middle East, which for ages has demonstrated its just commitment to international human and legal rights, including those of the Jewish people and of all people who have freedom of religion and access to the holy places throughout Israel, and whose proud tradition, that of Israel and the Jewish people, deserves praise and protection, not scapegoating.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. And I think that both of you touched on some of the issues we're seeing caused by the fractures that are existing in Western democracies at this moment. And I think I'd like to sort of start with some of the problems, and then maybe we can discuss some of the solutions. So, Richard, I'll come back to you first. If you could pinpoint what would you say is maybe the greatest thing you see influencing some of the problems, the threat that we have in to Western democracy at the moment?
We seem to never learn our lessons of history. It's all too easy to forget that barely 80 years ago, the concentration camps of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, were liberated in Germany and in Poland, barely 80 years ago. And we have not learned those lessons. The fact that a country, Germany, decided to adopt laws in 1933 that were racial laws and that banned Jews and others from the full enjoyment of life, banned them from academics, banned them from medicine, banned them from politics, banned them from being judges and lawyers. In our lifetime, we experienced that. And what lessons have we learned as we fast forward over those 80 years? Take a look at the United Nations itself. In 1975, they adopted a resolution equating Zionism, the national movement for the liberation of the Jewish people and the restoration to our ancestral homeland. They adopted a resolution equating Zionism with racism. What's the worst thing you can call a person? I think a racist. It's criminal, it's hateful, and nobody wishes to have a relationship with any racist. But the United Nations has continued to hammer at Israel every which way. And no matter what resolutions are passed and then vacated, the attitudes are the same. And it rolls all the way up to not just October 7th, October 8th and 9th, and since the turning on its head of the attack of Hamas, and I'll repeat words that I used before, the barbaric, heinous invasion of Hamas terrorists into the sovereign state of Israel, beheading, burning, maiming, killing, kidnapping, and raping people innocent people, dragging them out of their homes in kibbutzim in 20-some communities across southern Israel. And I have visited those communities, and I've met with families whose loved ones are still being held. Where is the call for the release? We haven't learned the lessons of history. We keep repeating them, and then we blame the victim. We blame Israel for having caused it. We blame Israel for having done this and having done that. We blame Prime Minister Netanyahu for being Prime Minister Netanyahu. And we demean the greatest democracy in the entire Middle East and one of the greatest democracies in the world. We have to learn our lessons from history, and then we have to teach those lessons to our young people, because they've turned away completely. They're almost deaf, and they are waving the flags of hate. They're helping the cause of those who prefer to hate. I hope, Richard, that addresses your point.
I think that gave us a lot to think about. Thank you very much for that, Richard. And Warren, I'm very interested in your opinion. What do you see as the if you could summarize or pinpoint one thing that you see as really what scares you as the biggest threat to our democracy at the moment?
Well, my background is, as Aubrey said, and thank you, Aubrey, for the nice introduction, is politics. And I spent many years in politics in this country, and also working in the United States and in Israel, and advising different politicians. And so guys like me, what we do is we look at problems or opportunities politically through the prism of public opinion research. You know, what do people think? We know what we think. What do Joe and Jane Front Porch think? If you look at the polling that has taken place in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe since the 7th, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is the vast majority of citizens are decent and tolerant and on our side. They support the state of Israel. They support Israel's ability and right to defend itself, because this is a defensive war. It's not a war that Israel initiated. Hamas broke the ceasefire. They support the notion of supporting the Jewish people. They welcome the Jewish people into their communities in Canada, the United States, and Europe. But there is a problem. And the problem has grown magnified since we last spoke. And all of you can see it. You don't have to be a public opinion research expert. You just have to turn on your TV or look at your computer screen. And it's the young people that we're seeing on these so-called encampments. I call them illegal occupations. We're seeing young people in the streets. We're seeing young people saying and doing terrible, awful things to Jews and to others, to those who support Israel and the Jewish people. Gen Z, which is people between the ages of 18 and 24, and millennials between the age of 25 and about 40, in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, are presently a lost generation. You will find no constituency or demographic who believes more in Holocaust denial. You will find no demographic who believes more that Hamas was right in what they did. You will find no demographic that believes that Israel must be wiped off the map from the river to the sea. We have a profound, the thing that worries me the most, you know, the union leaders, if we focus on getting rid of them, we can do that. Cleaning up academia, we can do that. You know, getting better and smarter politicians and journalists, we can do that. We've done that in the past as a society. When we have millions, because that's what I'm talking about, millions of young people who have embraced hatred and division and terrorism as a legitimate form of political expression, we have got a big, big problem. And it's not something that we're going to be able to solve in a year. I think we're looking at something that's going to take a decade or more to fix, because it's taken more than a decade to get us to this dark place. So that, to me, is the biggest problem we face.
And both of you mentioned youth in your answers to that question. So I'd like to stay on this theme and maybe explore it a little bit more. Warren, based on the the analysis that you just provided us. Maybe you can provide your insight into how do you think we got to this situation?
Well, the medium that we're all now on, this is the medium we're now on is the principal way people receive information about politics and current affairs and you name it. This is a technology that's transformed the world and in many respects has improved the world. But it has also facilitated something very dangerous and dark. Previously, I'm sure all of you are familiar with names like Paul Frum or Don Andrews or Wolfgang Droige, the neo-Nazi and white supremacist leaders who caused no shortage of trouble to right-thinking Canadians for decades. They were losers. They were always losers. When the internet came along, Zundel and Keegstra, the rest of them, they embraced it with a vengeance because it enabled them to propagate their message globally. It enabled them to do that without spending a nickel and enabled them to do it immediately around the world. It transformed the way in which they did business. And, the demographic that relies the most on the internet, and this is particularly the case since the pandemic, is young people. They're much more fluent in the ways of the internet and the different platforms, and the pandemic made it worse. And you may wonder, why do I say that? During the pandemic, young people were the worst impacted by what took place. It was the biggest political, cultural, economic event of our lifetimes. Young people couldn't have proms, they couldn't have commencement exercises at their universities and colleges. They went entirely online. Their lives became online, and they've experienced all kinds of mental issues as a consequence. But Iran and Qatar and the bad guys saw that and took advantage of it. They have been working this file, the bad people, and working to manipulate the minds of young people for years now. This is not something that happened on the morning of the 8th of October. They've been working it for a while. That is how they've gotten after young people on the very technology that we're all using tonight.
Thank you very much for that, Warren. And this actually segues into something I was hoping to discuss with Richard. Warren just touched on the subject briefly of foreign interference. And there, Richard, I know that a lot of your work has been representing the victims of terror. What role do you see as somebody who has litigated at times against these foreign governments? What role do you see foreign interference in playing in the current state we find ourselves in?
Well, let me use three examples. Warren mentioned two of them. He mentioned the Islamic Republic of Iran, and he mentioned Qatar, and I'm going to add the Syrian Arab Republic. In 1979, the United States created the list of state sponsors of terror and designated Syria as a state sponsor of terror, and it has remained on the State Department list every single day since 1979. Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, was added in 1984. Qatar, on the other hand, is not on the State Department list. So let's compare and contrast briefly those three countries. Syria has in the past hosted Hezbollah, hosted Hamas, and numerous federal courts in the United States have found the Syrian Arab Republic liable for having provided material support for Hamas, for Hezbollah, but also for ISIS. Move over to Iran. I mentioned in my opening point, Iran uses proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, but they also spend unbelievable money and they attack directly. Who would ever imagine that all those hundreds of rockets would be launched against a sovereign state by the Islamic Republic of Iran, and nobody would do anything about it? whether the quote is correct or not, whether it be the president or the Secretary of State of the United States, and I'm not being political, just analytical, made reportedly a comment, well, be thankful that none of them landed and you didn't lose anybody. Well, that's not an answer. It was a blatant act of direct war. And Iran will continue to do everything that it can do to use its power around the world to inflict pain on Israel, because it says that's what it is determined to do. It says that its goal is to annihilate Israel. Let's add Qatar for a moment. Qatar is not on the State Department list, and therefore they don't have the issues of being able to be sued in the United States, like Syria and Iran can be sued. But Qatar funded at least $2.7 billion of monies undeclared to the U.S. Department of Education. They funded it to universities across the United States. And a study has been done that correlates the hate on college campuses with those very campuses that received Qatari money. We have a serious problem. When our political leaders prefer to, shall we say, seek détente, seek to believe that dialogue will solve everything, and don't realize that we are facing, and I don't mean just we, Israel and the Jewish people, I mean freedom-loving democratic people around the world are facing assaults that are fueled by these terrorist states, and it can't be acceptable. And our political leaders have to stand up and do something about it.
Thank you, Richard. No, and I agree. I think that the time has come for Western democracies to take a strong and necessary stand. We at B'nai Brith are committed to constantly shifting the narrative to discuss Canadian values and the protection of a way of life that we've all come to expect. And more, it feels like that's being compromised. Turning back to you, Warren, one of the ways in which you suggested that a next generation was being corrupted was online. And we know that our government is in the process of passing online harms legislation. But given your experience as a political strategist, I was wondering if maybe you could comment on how you thought the Canadian government could better address perhaps this online ecosystem, which you believe is contributing so much to the degradation of a next generation of Canadians.
Well, in their package of laws, and I think it's anybody's guess as to whether that bill will be passed before the next election takes place. It looks suspiciously like something that is not intended to pass before the next election. But, you know, on balance, there's some things in there that I welcome. Looks like there's a return of Section 13 of the Human Rights Code, which would provide for a non-criminal sanction to apply against those who express hatred against Jews and others. But, you know, I think, echoing what I said at the outset, we have the laws now. You know, we have laws against propagating hatred against identifiable groups, willfully propagating genocide. We've got an ample number of laws to deal with the kind of lawlessness we're seeing in the streets. What we don't have is a willingness on the part of our elected officials to make use of the laws that we already have. We have some of the most comprehensive anti-hate laws in the world. Like the other countries come and study the way in which we've approached this subject, the way in which we've dealt with it. But for example, if you look at the section about promoting hatred against an identifiable group, I was involved in one successful prosecution of a hate-filled newspaper called Your Word News in Toronto. Some of you who live in Toronto may remember it. And it was terrible. And it promoted Holocaust denial and promoted Adolf Hitler and National Socialism. And it took us years, but we eventually persuaded the Attorney General of Ontario to bring charges against the publisher and the editor of that publication. And they were convicted. promoting hatred against Jews and women. First time in Canadian history, there had been a successful prosecution of promoting hatred against women. And they appealed and they lost and they went to jail. So, you know, we had in that case, and we still have now, the ability to deal with these problems. But since the 7th, when we've witnessed this tidal wave of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred in this country, we've got statistically one of the worst problems in the world. Our political leaders have just not shown the kind of leadership that all of us, whether we're Jewish or not, expect of them. Like, you know, in Toronto, we've got a mayor who I don't think is an evil person. I know her. And, you know, she won't attend the lifting of the Israeli flag on the occasion of Independence Day, something that's happened in Toronto for decades, because she considers it divisive. And then days later, we have this shooting at a school in Toronto, in a synagogue. Like, you know, the bad guys pay attention to the way in which our leaders react to these events. They pay attention to the way in which the police and the prosecutors react. And if the reaction is non-existent, you know, if some thug wearing a mask in the Eaton Center, one of the biggest shopping malls in the country, can lean across in front of police officers and say, I'm going to put you 6 feet under to someone, and get away with it, as he did for weeks and weeks, well, then we're going to have more of a problem. So, you know, that would be my view, is that we need to start, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've already got the wheel. We can apply the laws we've got, but we need to have leadership and a willingness to make use of those laws and carries those prosecutions to their conclusion.
Richard, I'd like to comment on Warren's
I
point.
would love nothing more, Richard. The floor is yours.
You know, Warren talks about essentially leadership by example, and when leaders fail, we all suffer. Take a look at what the United States has done regarding the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran takes hostages, and we pay billions of dollars to get the hostages back. Is it any wonder that Hamas came after hostages, knowing that they would be able to take those hostages, hold them dead and alive, and be able to exact a price? They have learned because of our own leadership failures, and I blame the United States, because it's the United States who has given to the Islamic Republic of Iran over the past decade or so, reportedly $150 billion. The very country that takes American citizens, and some of them are clients of our law firm, that takes American citizens and holds them in prison for bargaining chips, the very country that sponsors terror all over the world, and then we reward them. And it's also that same country that needed, I would like to accuse, needed a cover period for finishing their nuclear ambitions. And they've had that cover period. Well, I guarantee you, we're going to see this rollout of Iranian nuclear power with weapon capability, notwithstanding the fact that the President of the United States and others have declared that Iran would never have nuclear weapon capability. I predict that it will be proven that since October 7th, they have rapidly completed their capabilities so that they have an arsenal to attack, and that arsenal doesn't only threaten those of us in democracies, it threatens other countries in the Middle East. They are concerned, and it has created a divide, a global divide that is very dangerous. The alignment that has been created between Russia and China and North Korea and Iran and others. I think it was President George W. Bush who once referred to those countries as an axis of evil. Perhaps it wasn't him, but we're facing that evil, and it's because of leadership failure. So Warren is absolutely right when he says we have to look to our leaders for what they're elected to do, and that is provide leadership, not be cowards that teach the bad and wrong lessons.
And thank you for that, Richard. A common theme I've seen in the last part of our discussion has been a lack of will or accountability on the part of government, whether it relates to combating foreign interference, handling rise in online harms or online hate, or even preventing the indoctrination or the disillusionment of our youth. So I'm going to throw this out to either one of you. Feel free to answer. What sort of solutions do you see, perhaps in the law or elsewhere, to compel accountability from our government leaders, whether in the United States or Canada? Richard, Warren, any insight?
Well, very quickly, I can say there's a Canadian who leads a wonderful group in New York and mainly active in the United States called the Lawfare Project. And she's a graduate of McGill, but now she practices law in New York, and she's got an army of lawyers, and their function, their purpose is to go after people who discriminate against and harass and terrorize the Jewish community. And one of her partners, who I've spoken to previously, was in Toronto just this week on behalf of a student, a young woman who attended the Ontario College of Art and Design. And when she was there over a period of years, was subjected to all kinds of abuse and harassment, and it got worse after the 7th. And so the Lawfare Project, representing this young woman, is now suing OCAD for well in excess of $1 million in damages for the capricious and cruel way they dealt with her. And to me, regrettably, I regret that it's come to that, where we need to, sue. Citizens have to take the law into their own hands. But if we have a situation, as Richard and I have described, that we do, where leaders are not exercising the powers that we grant to them in elections, if that's what's happening, well, then citizens have to step up. In my case, going after Your Ward News, I couldn't get the Crown and the police to pick up the phone. So I appeared before a justice of the peace, and I initiated what's called a private prosecution, and got at the agreement of the justice of the peace to commence a prosecution of the publisher and the editor of Your Ward News. And it ultimately resulted in them going to jail. So I think that is one thing that all of us, you don't need to be a lawyer, can and should do. If we see a situation, and there are many, that is egregious and wrong in the targeting of Canadian Jews, then we need to, if our leaders won't act, we need to compel them to act. And that's one way to do it.
And Richard, I saw that you wanted to provide your insight on this one. So what's your opinion on this? I'm sure you're a fan of lawfare as well. Lawfare, then the general concept of the using law as a vehicle to fight back.
Yeah, Warren is absolutely right. Brooke Goldstein, who heads the Lawfare Project, is outstanding, and she's a great example among many that are utilizing the court system to bring attention, not just globally, but on a localized basis. I'm a big believer, Richard, in what I call zero tolerance law. We have to take a look at every situation and take some action. We cannot subscribe to what was at one time the Shah still mentality. Being quiet doesn't do us any good. Being quiet leads to Holocaust denial, distortion, and people not caring. We have to take action in a way that is targeted and strategic and powerful. That means in federal courts, that means in state courts, but it also means in the international courts. Our firm has filed briefs in the International Court of Justice, both in 2004 and recently, and also in the International Criminal Court, because those world courts of the United Nations are being used not just to demonize Israel. They demonize the good name of Israel and the Jewish people. And as has been said by people smarter than us, and I'm going to paraphrase, when they're done coming for the Jews, they will come for you. Believe me, it's a total taking of the expression to try to make a point. And the fact is, if we're quiet about it, it won't do us any good. We have to stand up. We have to be counted. We have to speak out. And we have to re-engage with that younger generation that Warren was talking about before, because we've lost too many of them. In spite of the fact that we've literally spent billions of dollars as a community here in Canada and in the United States, fighting anti-Semitism and fighting hate, and in the battle for human rights, we've obviously failed if you look at what has gone on just since October 7th.
Thank you, Richard. And when it comes to using the courts to fight back, B'nai Brith has, I'm very proud to say that B'nai Brith has been emboldened and unafraid to take the gloves off and to support litigation and to utilize litigation as a tool to ensure that rights are being upheld. One of the narratives that we're hearing in Canada, especially when it comes to litigation around things like the encampments, is the balancing act between human rights and charter rights, or in the United States, constitutional rights, the right for somebody to feel safe on campus or to not be intimidated, versus the right for somebody to have freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And since I have two such amazing legal minds before me, I was wondering if either one of you wants to comment on that very difficult balancing act between human rights and in constitutional rights.
Well, I spoke to the media about this yesterday because there's been an ongoing circus at McGill and the University of Toronto and UBC and, you know, most of our elite universities in Canada and, of course, in the United States and in Europe, too. I was talking to somebody in Britain today, a professor who was telling me what was going on at her university, and it's madness, absolute madness. The thing that I don't understand about the leadership at our universities, who are supported in part by public monies, is why they feel they have a need to seek the approval of the courts to remove these people. A small percentage of them are students. The majority, in almost every single case, are non-students. Universities are found on private property, almost without exception. If somebody's on private property illegally, as these people are, well, then you remove them for trespass, or you sue them for trespass, or you have them prosecuted for trespass. It's really simple. You don't need to go to the courts to seek an injunction. But the University of Toronto, in its wisdom, has decided to do that. And now they've got a situation where that encampment will remain in the very place where convocation exercises are supposed to be taking place in a few days from now. McGill, the same thing. At McGill, two young Jewish students said, "We feel intimidated trying to cross campus at the Roddick Gates on Sherbrooke Street because of the encampment that is there." And the university refused to support them. And then 2 weeks later changed its mind and said to the Quebec Superior Court, "Well, we would like to get an injunction to get them kicked out." And the court said, "Forget it. You know, you were disinterested the first time. We're not interested in accommodating you the second time." So the leadership that we haven't seen at the political level, sadly, it exists at the level of post-secondary education too. I don't understand it, why they feel they need to go to the courts to kick these people out. And my alma mater, where I went to law school, the University of Calgary, and I always joke that they handed us our degree off the back of a pickup truck. They got rid of these idiots immediately. They called in the police and they just got them out of there. They tore apart their encampment and they're gone, and they haven't come back. That's how you deal with it, in my view. But, you know, I defer to Richard's knowledge on this one.
Well, I think we have to recognize that free speech is one thing, but hate speech is something else. And coupled with hate speech, you have actual acts of violence, assaults, intimidation, threats, trespass, and they should all be prosecuted. And where appropriate, there should also not only be criminal charges, but there should be civil charges brought. You know, when we did the briefs we filed with the International Court of Justice, we worked with your excellent and our dear friend David Matas, who's one of the greatest human rights lawyers in Canada. And I applaud him and I appreciate him. I think if David were here with us, he would say that Israel and the Jewish people are entitled to their good name, and they're entitled not to be maligned, and they are entitled to equal standing among all the nations of the world. That has been totally wiped out since October 7th, and we have to be smart about it. We have to take a look to say, who is it that's behind it? Who has funded all of these encampments? How is it they were so well organized, many of them with exactly the same green Hamas tents? Where did the bricks come from? Where did all the travel come from? And what role are the designated terror organizations playing in all of this? The same way the terror organizations have played a role for more than 20 years since Durban in providing the support for the boycott movement and in encouraging hate, hate, hate. That's their mantra. And we just have done a very poor job as a community, and those who are our allies from religions across the spectrum have been stronger in standing up than we have ourselves. And it's time that we stand up proudly and strongly for Israel and the Jewish people.
Thank you for that, Richard. And I just want to comment, I'm so glad that you mentioned David Matus. We are so lucky to have David Matus as our senior legal counsel at B'nai Brith. And one thing that I'm grateful for is his expertise in balancing rights, and to have somebody who is so learned in appreciating and understanding human rights allows a group like ours, when we say that something is beyond the pale and that something is violating human rights, to really know that we're doing that with certain. So I just wanted to say thank you for mentioning Mr. Matus. It is indeed a privilege to work with him. I see a question that came to me in the chat, and it has to do with the media. And we're talking about threats to our democracy and issues in our democracy. And more I'm seeing myself, the media, presenting a threat to the sanctity of our democracy. And I'm wondering, gentlemen, if either one of you wants to comment on the media as an issue, or what we can do to counteract media bias.
Well, I'll go first because I practice the sin of journalism, and I've taught innocent youngsters how to be journalists. And I presently write for the biggest newspaper chain in the country, which I'm proud to say is probably the most pro-Israel media organization on the continent. The big problem we've got, more than bias, guys, is economics. Media in the traditional sense is dying. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Bad decisions by the media themselves, the growth of advertising on platforms like Facebook, changes in the way people receive information. There's all kinds of reasons for it, but it's happening. So when I was in Israel just about a week ago, they brought me and some other Canadian writers over. And one of the main reasons we were brought over there to see the terrible scenes at the kibbutzim and Sderot, and talk to people who had been victims of Hamas and dealt with the worst sort of terror. One of the reasons they brought us over there is I don't think there's a single Canadian news organization that maintains a bureau in Israel anymore. And when you think about that, when you think that there's no Canadian journalist or set of eyes on what's taking place in Israel, it explains an awful lot of the coverage that we're seeing or not seeing, as the case may be. So I think what the biggest problem we've got at the moment is the media are constrained. And so what the public are doing when they're seeking information, when they're hungry for information about the war or what have you, they're going online. And as both Richard and I testified to a few minutes ago, what they're finding is, if they're an 18-year-old who uses TikTok as their principal source of information, and that's what 18-year-olds do, by the way. They don't use Google, they don't use Bing, they use TikTok. They're seeing anti-Semitic content produced in Iran and Qatar and financed in the People's Republic of China. And so, this is one of the consequences of a constrained economic environment for our media, is that people are seeking out information that is propagated by those who put together conspiracy theories and hatred against the Jewish people. And that's a big, big problem. So, you know, I know it's easy to get mad at the media these days, and you know, that's an important part of democracy. But I think the bigger issue is the fact that we don't have good journalism being done on the truth. And the truth is that Israel is the victim and Hamas is the victimizer.
And Richard, if I could just follow up on something that Warren said with a specific question for you. Warren briefly touched on foreign influence in the media, in social media. Given your expertise in prosecuting and combating foreign influence, how much of a threat is foreign influence to Western media?
Tremendous threat. Take a look at Al Jazeera. It's bought and paid for, owned, supported by the government of Qatar. It's Qatar that has, as we've already said, funded more hate on university campuses and influenced buying in Washington than practically any other country. But I want to add something that Warren so appropriately mentioned, and that is people are getting their news today in new ways. They are getting their news in sound bites, and they are getting their news in, shall we say, flashes. All people want to know is what's the one line piece of information, and then they move on, especially our young people. As Aubrey mentioned at the beginning, my wife, Phyllis Greenberg Heideman, is the president of the International March of the Living. Many of you in Canada have either participated on the March of the Living, or you well know it, and as an important and influential organization over the last 36 years. This year, on the March of the Living, very quietly, a group of TikTok influencers were brought on the March of the Living. And my information is that they have reached millions and millions of people with truthful videos of a survivor giving their soundbite testimony, or standing in front of the barracks in Auschwitz where they might have lived for years of their lives. What's the lesson from that? It seems to me we can't turn on our young people. If we have failed them, let's start anew. We need to reach them in camps, in schools, and in after-school activities. We need to teach them leadership training. We need to teach them responsibility and accountability, and we need to share with them truthful history. But we also need to give them platforms in which and from which they can share their views and turn around to the truth. Lastly, this. My father, Oliver Sholem, taught me a long time ago, the pendulum swings both ways. You are not going to stop that pendulum, but we can all do a little pushing of the pendulum. And I think the key is those young people that Warren talked about.
And Richard, I couldn't have asked you for a better segue into my next question. Warren, you did talk about the young people, and one of the troubling trends, perhaps influenced by social media, and that I'm seeing is this link, undue, really grotesque link between Hamas and being a righteous cause. What do you feel, gentlemen? I'll start with Warren, but Richard, feel free to chime in. Why do you feel that Hamas has and Palestinian militants have been so endearing their cause to certain elements in our society, especially younger members of society?
136 million. 136 million. I did a search a couple days ago for two words, genocide and Israel. Those two words married together online 136 million times. What that means, guys, and I'm going to be blunt here, we are getting our asses kicked online in telling our story. The bad guys are spending a lot of money. They've got a lot of organization, and they are pushing their message hard. From the river to the sea, the figures on that I found, not as many as 136 million, but just about half from the river to the sea. I spoke to an expert in Tel Aviv yesterday. She appeared before the Facebook Oversight Board, as it's called, in Washington, to implore them to do what they did with the QAnon slogan that was used to promote violence just 2 or 3 years ago, and say, you need to either, if you won't deny the use of this phrase online, from the river to the sea, this oblique call for genocide against the Jewish state, well, then you need to at least, show it a little bit less in search results. Because in an attack in Amsterdam that caused millions of dollars in euros in damage, like on the sides of synagogues in Barcelona, in Philadelphia, wherever you look, that phrase has been used as an incitement for violence and hatred. And it's all over the internet. So, I think the social media platforms, they're making an awful lot of money out of us. All of us are a commodity to the social media mavens, the people who have made, untold billions. They have more money than most small countries. They have an obligation to society to deal with the problem that manifestly exists on their platforms. And if they will not do that, as the U.S. House of Representatives showed 2 weeks ago, Democrats and Republicans came together to say if TikTok does not change its ownership structure by next year, it will be banned from the United States. It's currently banned from a lot of government devices. And that's what we should be doing. We should be saying TikTok is one of the principal platforms for anti-Semitic hate on the planet. And if it doesn't clean up its act, if it doesn't change the way in which it operates, we will ban it. There are things that we can do as a society to deal with the very real problems that exist online. But it requires a concerted effort of all of us, because it's not enough for one country to do this. There has to be a unified effort to do so.
Warren, you just blew me away with those statistics. That's incredibly eye-opening as somebody whose day job is trying to combat those phrases and monitor the ubiquitousness with which they seem to be being used in our society. That was incredibly disheartening, but it's good to know in a sobering way. Richard, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Just briefly, 20 some years ago, at the United Nations Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa, there was a hate fest against Israel and the Jewish people that the world applauded. And since that time, the United Nations has praised it, has advanced it, called the Durban Program. The essence of the Durban Program is to continue doing everything possible to label Israel as an apartheid, racist, criminal state. Fast forward to just the past year, even before October 7th. Israel hauled by the United Nations again before the International Court of Justice. Israel hauled by South Africa before the International Court of Justice. And Israel now facing arrest warrants of its leadership, the prime minister and the defense minister, for alleged genocide in their response to the Hamas genocidal attacks. The world, if they were to vote today, one country, one vote at the United Nations, they would probably vote by an overwhelming majority to expel Israel as a nation state, as a member of the United Nations. And what have we done about it over these last 24 years? We, the organized Jewish community, have had lots of meetings, committee meetings, and we've raised lots of money. and we've paid a lot of salaries, and we've done this and we've done that, but have we made an impact? I believe we have not. We have in many ways not battled the anti-Semitism, not battled the anti-Zionism, not battled the anti-Israelism. We have not changed history at all. And I conclude with this, two pieces. A, if you ask somebody from the Palestinian Authority over the last 24 years, what's the weather today? The answer is the occupation. If you ask them what time it is, the answer is the occupation. The messaging is on target. If you ask somebody in our community, you never know what you're going to get. And at least half the community will blame Israel for everything. Lastly, just shortly before October 7th, there are two statements that I will paraphrase. One attributed to Mahmoud Abbas. Reportedly, he said, nobody cares about the Palestinian issue anymore. We have to do something to get it back to the top of the agenda. And the last one is this. Shortly before October 7th, reportedly, the leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran said, in response to reports that Saudi Arabia was getting ready to establish and normalize relations with Israel, the leader of Iran reportedly said something like, don't bet on those Israelis. They're losers. You just wait and see. October 7th was one of the most heinous, barbaric acts in modern history. And the world has turned completely on Israel and the Jewish people as the victims. If we cannot learn and do not learn from this, we have to ask ourselves, what is our future in the very democracies we all cherish?
Thank you. I know that it's now after 8 p.m. There's a couple more questions in the chat. Aubrey, do you want us to keep going, or?
I think previously I have asked Warren and Richard if we went a little bit over time, if they would cooperate, and the answer was yes. So, gentlemen, unless the two of you have another commitment, we would like to continue with a few more questions if we could.
Of course.
Absolutely.
So
thank you, gentlemen.
I see one more question in the chat, and then I think I have one more for you gentlemen as well, to bring us back to the purpose of our discussion. So this question, I believe, is best suited for Warren, that's in the chat, given your expertise in Canadian politics. The Foreign Agent Registry Bill is now before the Public Safety Committee. Is there anything that you believe is missing in the bill? And outside of China, which has captivated our parliament in its exploration of foreign interference, which country should Canada fear the most in their activities interfering in Canadian society and politics?
Iran. And, the Foreign Agent Registry, so we'll finally be joining the League of Nations, like the United States, that's had such a registry for years. One of the changes I would make is make the penalties more severe for non-compliance, as the Americans have done. But, anybody who's representing the interests of Iran, as Samadoun does in Vancouver, led by an American. I'm not sure why she's here or why she's permitted to be here. These organizations, if they're not receiving funding from Iran, they're receiving oversight and they're talking points from Iran, right? We've seen that now for months. So what we need to be doing is equipping our intelligence agencies, CSIS and the RCMP Security Service, and we should give some credit to the RCMP Security Service. Aubrey will know, he and I have talked about it. The RCMP Security Service foiled a terrorist plot against the Jewish community in the city of Ottawa involving some young offenders. They were effective. They stopped that, and they deserve our thanks for doing so. But you need resources and training for that kind of police work. And so that's what I would like to see happen, because anybody who's representing the interest of Iran, which is the principal source of evil in the world at the present time, is not going to be bothering with a foreign agent registry. We need to be making sure that our intelligence agencies and our police agencies are equipped to go after those people, because as we've seen in the 2019 and 2021 elections with China, they don't quibble, they don't bother with the niceties of Canadian law and regulatory compliance. They just go ahead and break the law. So we need to make sure that we've got the tools at the level of the police and intelligence agencies to fight that.
Thank you, Warren. And both Warren and Richard, I've really, truly enjoyed, and I can only assume that our audience has too, the depth of information and nuanced opinion that you've been able to provide in your answers. And Richard, I've particularly been taken aback by your message of learning from the past, and I think that that's been an underlying theme of both of your answers tonight. The need to learn so that we can escape an avoidable future. I wanted to conclude with one question for each of you, as both of you seem to be on the forefront in different ways of defending our democracy. What's something that has made you hopeful in your fight to preserve democracy?
Richard, go first.
If either Richard or Warren wants to take a stab at that.
I'm happy to. In the United States, we have the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. There are times, partisanship aside, when the confluence of each of those branches can really make a difference. I'll be specific. In seeking to hold sponsors of terror legally accountable, which is our work, we have had times when we have worked directly with the White House, the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, members of Congress, other lawyers, and the victims. Every victim lives somewhere. Even if they live in Israel, if they're an American victim, they have a base of some kind in the United States. They were born here, or they have a residence here, or whatever. And therefore, every victim has an advocate, a member of Congress, Democrat, Republican, Independent. Those members of Congress, the House and the Senate, stand up for their constituents. What we try to do is get to every member of Congress to tell them the story of the pain and the suffering of their constituents who are victims of terror. And we find that universally, the confluence of efforts come together to stand on behalf of the fiber and fabric of the family that has suffered so gravely. You asked me to be positive, but I must be very straightforward. I mentioned earlier about presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers and ambassadors. Where have they been since October 7th? I want to just amplify that for a moment. Reportedly, people from 42 different countries were killed, maimed, or taken hostage on October 7th. Where is the civilized world? What they've done is they've called for Israel to, quote, bring home the hostages. But it's the wrong call. The call should have been, and today must be, release the hostages. Put the burden where it belongs. It's on Hamas. And Hamas, by the way, is the acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement. And they've hijacked the term resistance to make it sound pure. We are resisting the occupation of the Israelis. The fact of the matter is they're resisting the very existence of the state of Israel. I close with this. A lot of people find him controversial. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I believe, is the one who may have been the one who said, when your enemy tells you they're going to kill you, you better listen to them. And here we are in the aftermath of October 7th, and Iran is calling today, as I said earlier in this program, Iran is calling today for the annihilation of Israel and therefore for the killing of Jews and others who love and cherish freedom. We can't take this lying down. Every single one of us have to get our families, our grandparents, our parents, our young people, get them all activated, get our leaders activated, our political leaders activated, and build the confluence that can sometimes be so positive. And if we will gather the people in and tell them there is a cause here, this is a cause of justice, this is a cause of human rights, this is a cause of ancestral rights. This is a cause of pride for Israel and the Jewish people. We don't deserve to be maligned. We deserve the opportunity to continue to grow and thrive as a people, whether we live in the diaspora or whether we live in Jerusalem. All of us together, no matter our race or religion, have to stand up together doing what you asked about, Richard, and that is defending democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was incredibly powerful and inspiring. Warren, do you have any final thoughts about what's inspiring you in your defense of democracy?
Well, I mean, Richard and I have been critical of our leaders and prosecutors and police and the media, and deservedly so, this evening. But you know, one thing that the bad people are doing, you know, they're having all their rallies, they're having their illegal occupations, they're bringing their people out in great numbers and being loud and aggressive and abusive. Why are they doing that? In politics, I can tell you, we always book a room that's too small for many more people. And we do that to show momentum, to show strength, right? Visually, and also to intimidate the other side and to demoralize them. That is what these people are doing. And, you know, it's testament to all of you who are on this call tonight under the leadership of the B'nai Brith, who I believe has been at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism, not just since the 7th, but for many, many decades before that. We need to do things as citizens, whether you come out on the walk that is taking place. It's the 9th, is it not?
Yes.
On the 9th in Toronto. I'm going to be there. Encourage all of you to be there. In my case, you know, my background, I run war rooms, right? I know how to run political war rooms, quick response, opposition research. I'm not bad at it. So I decided, nobody else was doing it in Canada, fighting anti-Semitism in Canada. So I set up a group called Facts Matter. And we're now generating video reports and news reports and social media and so on. And we've got the support of amazing people like Aubrey and Senator Gravstein. And like, that's just one example of something that people can do. We need to push back. We cannot be intimidated. We cannot be scared away from this fight, because we are on the right side. We are on the righteous side. We are on the side that people need to hear from. They want to hear from us, but we are being quiet too often, and understandably so, because people are intimidated. We cannot be intimidated by these thugs. So we need to stand up and support the politicians. Like Doug Ford today said something that all of us know that is true. He said today, if you come to Canada, you need to exhibit the values of Canada. And you cannot be coming here to shoot up a Jewish school. And so the Toronto Star and CBC are going to rain all kinds of abuse on him tomorrow, guaranteed. So all of you, I suggest to you, get out your pen, get out your computers and say, I support what Doug Ford said, because he's right. If you come here, whether you're a Muslim or a Hindu or of any faith, and you do not embrace Canadian values, and our way of life and law and order, well, then you don't belong here. That's common sense. We should not be intimidated away from saying that. And we should not be intimidated away again from representing our side, because we are on the right side and we are in the right. So thank you, all of you tonight, for listening to us.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Warren. It was truly a privilege to get to participate in this discussion with you. Aubrey, I'm going to turn it over to you now to close us out for the evening.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for hosting a wonderful evening again. You've done a wonderful job, Rich, on behalf of B'nai Brith. And I'd like to thank you, Warren and Richard, for a very informative, sincere, and detailed Zoom chat. Your unprecedented support and presentation of fact and truth is refreshing, and the path to a future for Canada and all who came here for a better life for their children, grandchildren, and future generations would seem a little brighter today if all of our media reporting was as professional and as honest as the two of you have been. You are both exceptional human beings, and from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of all communities, I thank you for the work that you are doing. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to inform you with regard to our upcoming fireside chats. We are currently working on our summer and fall schedule. I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. Please look forward to the future invitations, and let's all pray for light to overpower darkness during these very difficult times. We will see you soon, and good night.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Warren. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Aubrey.